Hello, y'all. It's me. It's Dr. G, and welcome to Star-Spangled Studies. And we're going to start right away in 1865 with Abraham Lincoln standing amidst the wreckage of a nation torn apart, and he spoke of the Civil War in his second inaugural address. He observed that, quote, both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came, end quote. That war, the United States Civil War, serves as a hinge point in our national story. This podcast series accompanies your journey through United States history from 1865 to the present, aligning with the textbook The American Yop. It's free, it's online, it's collaboratively built, and like this series, aims to provide an accessible narrative reflecting the best of the recent historical scholarship, incorporating diverse voices, and exploring dynamism and conflict inherent in our past. Please be sure to download and follow along for the best results in understanding United States history. But indeed, to understand the history of America of 1865 and beyond, we have to understand the challenges of Reconstruction, the rise of industrial power, the struggle for civil rights, and the nation's emergence as a global force. But we first must grasp its roots. We need to explore the crucial period before 1865. As one historian reminds us, quote, from the enforcement of the rights of citizens to the stubborn problems of economic and racial justice, the issues central to Reconstruction are as old as the American Republic and as contemporary as the inequalities that still afflict our society, end quote. So in this first episode, we'll journey back before 1865. We'll examine the promises and the paradox born in the American Revolution, trace the struggles of building a new nation amidst rapid expansion and deepening division, witness the entrenchment of slavery alongside the rise of King Cotton, and finally confront the cataclysm of the Civil War itself. Our guiding question throughout all of this will simply be, how did the ideals proclaimed at the nation's founding clash so profoundly with its realities, particularly the institution of slavery, leading to escalating conflict, a brutal civil war, and set the stage of an unresolved question that would haunt the decades after 1865? So let's go. So let's start with the American Revolution, and this was far more than simply just a colonial rebellion. It was, as historian Gordon Wood argues, a truly radical event, not just politically, but socially. It fundamentally challenged the hierarchical, differential world of colonial America. Before the Revolution, Wood notes, quote, ordinary people were made only to be born and eat and sleep and die and to be forgotten, end quote. The Revolution unleashed powerful, world-changing ideas about liberty, equality, popular sovereignty, and republicanism, the notion that government should serve the public good. Wood continues that, quote, within decades following the Declaration of Independence, the United States became the most egalitarian nation in the history of the world, end quote. This new egalitarian spirit meant, as Wood puts it, that ordinary Americans came to believe that, quote, no one in a basic, down-to-earth and day-in and day-out manner was really better than anyone else, end quote. It fostered a society that was perhaps, quote, the most thoroughly commercialized nation in the world, breaking down old forms of patronage and dependence. At the heart of this transformation lies the Declaration of Independence and its electrifying assertion. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was then, as it is now, a profound statement, a foundational stone for American identity. Yet it contained a deep and immediate paradox felt at the time. How could a nation founded on such principles simultaneously enslave hundreds of thousands and later millions of people? The hypocrisy was not lost on contemporaries. Samuel Johnson, a British writer, famously quipped, quote, How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes, end quote. This contradiction, liberty for some, bondage for others, was woven into the fabric of the new nation. While colonists demanded representation, arguing, as Daniel Delaney did, that, quote, a right to impose an internal tax on the colonies without their consent for the single purpose of revenue is denied, end quote, the rights of many within those colonies were themselves systematically violated. The revolutionary spirit did, however, open doors for questioning existing hierarchies. Abigail Adams famously urged her husband John, who was then at the Continental Congress, to, quote, remember the ladies in the new laws, a hinting of the burgeoning awareness of women's rights sparked by the revolution's own rhetoric. Native American nations navigated the conflict with complexity, attempting to protect their sovereignty as seen in the Oneida Declaration of Neutrality, foreshadowing the relentless pressure they would face from the expanding United States. For African Americans, the revolution was a double-edged sword. For some, like Crispus Attucks, who died in the Boston Massacre, he became a symbol of the fight against tyranny. Many enslaved people seized the opportunity presented by the chaos of war to gain freedom, yet the revolution ultimately strengthened the institution of slavery in the South, not lessened it. And it created a fundamental conflict that would fester and grow throughout the next 80 years. The revolution, therefore, wasn't a neat conclusion, but the beginning of a long, often violent argument over who we the people truly included, as well as what equality and liberty really meant. This ongoing struggle to realize the revolution's promises forms the essential backdrop of the period after 1865. Emerging from the revolution, the fledgling United States faced a daunting task of creating a stable republic. This era saw intense political debates, widespread Western expansion, and a transformative market revolution to coincide with the ever-deepening shadow and rise of slavery. Political divisions emerged almost immediately. Federalists, often representing mercantile interests, favored a stronger central government, while Jeffersonian Republicans championed an agrarian vision and feared large centralized power. Some Federalists, like Fisher Ames, worried that democracy itself was dangerous, predicting it would lead eventually to anarchy. Thomas Jefferson hailed his election in 1800 as a second revolution, quote, as real a revolution in the principles of our government as that of 76 was in its form, end quote, marked a shift towards greater political influence of non-elite white men. Simultaneously, the nation pushed relentlessly westward. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803, orchestrated by Jefferson, dramatically doubled the country's size, opening vast territories. While seen as a triumph for the agrarian vision, this expansion brought immediate and intense conflict. It raised the explosive question of whether new states carved from these territories would permit slavery, a question that would dominate national politics until the war itself. It also meant the dispossession and displacement of Native American populations. Leaders like the Shawnee brothers Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa attempted to forge a pan-Indian alliance to resist American encroachment, with Tecumseh declaring, quote, we are determined to defend our lands, and if it is his will, we wish to leave our bones upon them, end quote. Their resistance, though powerful, ultimately faced the overwhelming force of the expanding nation. The early 19th century also witnessed a market revolution. Innovations like the cotton gin, which we'll discuss in a moment, as well as new transportation networks like the Erie Canal, spurred on by a new technology, steamboats, spurred economic growth and change. Basil Hall, a British visitor in 1829, described the new boomtown of Rochester, New York as a direct result of the Erie Canal. Factories like the textile mills in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, emerged, creating new opportunities but also new class tensions. The traditional world of artisans governed by apprentice contracts, like the one from 1836 described in the textbook Reader in the Volume 1, gave way to a new form of labor, wage labor. Women, particularly young unmarried women, entered the factory workforce, though societal expectations, as observed by Alexis de Tocqueville, increasingly confined middle and upper class women to the, quote, separate spheres of the home. Workers began to organize, like the Lowell Mill, where workers Harriet H. Robinson remembered striking in 1836. These economic and territorial changes were inseparable from the issue of slavery itself. The Haitian Revolution, which concluded in 1804, was the only successful slave uprising, and it created a second independent republic in the Americas, and it sent shockwaves across the United States itself. It was, in the words of Black abolitionist David Walker, the, quote, glory of the blacks and terror of the tyrants, end quote. And it inspired enslaved people and fueled much white fears. Rebellions like Gabriel's uprising in Virginia in 1800, though suppressed, demonstrated the persistent desire for freedom, but also led to harsher laws against both enslaved and free black people. There was to be no Haitian Revolution on American shores. It was during this period, as historian Ira Berlin argues, that key regions, particularly in the South, transitioned from being, quote, societies with slaves, that was where slavery existed, but wasn't the central economic engine, to, quote, slave societies, where slavery became fundamentally the backbone to the economy, to the politics, and the social structure. Berlin emphasizes that slavery was not static. It was actually a constantly negotiated relationship over time, shaped by the actions and the resistance of the enslaved themselves, even within the brutal constraints of the system. The expansion westward provided the land. The market revolution provided the demand, particularly for cotton, and slavery provided the labor, creating a tightly interwoven system that propelled the nation forward while simultaneously deepening the divisions between North and South that would tear it apart. Understanding this nexus, expansion, market forces, and crucially slavery, is vital to comprehending why the sectional crisis eventually became unavoidable and led to war. As the 19th century unfolded, one crop came to dominate the Southern economy and increasingly national politics: cotton. The invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1794, combined with the developments of fertile lands in the newly acquired territories of the Deep South and the insatiable demand from textile mills in the northern states and Great Britain, created what the textbook calls a cotton revolution. Cotton became king, King Cotton, and it transformed the Southern landscape in oh so many ways. Observers like Joseph Holt Ingram described the rush to cultivate as a, quote, mania. This economic boom, however, was built entirely on the backs of enslaved people. Cotton and slavery, as our textbook notes, grew hand in hand. The demand for labor fueled a massive forced migration, the domestic slave trade, or the Second Middle Passage, tearing apart families in older slave states like Virginia and Maryland, who sent hundreds of thousands of people to the brutal conditions of the cotton and sugar plantations of the Deep South and Mississippi Valley. Ira Berlin vividly documents the travel of this forced migration, the destruction of kinship networks, and the ways enslaved people sought to rebuild communities and families in these new, harsher environments, often naming children after relatives left behind to maintain connections across generations. Life within the Cotton Kingdom was defined by labor, violence, and resistance. Enslaved people developed rich cultures centered on family, kinship, and religion, often blending African and African American traditions with Christianity in ways their enslavers barely understood. Religion could be a source of solace and hope, but also, as in the case of Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion, a source of inspiration and resistance. Turner saw his violent uprising, which terrified white Southerners and led to even harsher slave codes, as an act of God. Resistance took many forms, from outright rebellion to everyday acts of defiance. Harriet Jacobs, writing about her escape from sexual exploitation and bondage, described her struggle as, quote, something akin to freedom. As cotton cultivation expanded westward, the political question of slavery's future intensified, leading to the sectional crisis. Attempts at political compromise proved increasingly futile. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 temporarily quieted the storm by admitting Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and drawing a line across the Louisiana Purchase territory. But the acquisitions of new lands after the Mexican-American War again reignited the conflict. The Compromise of 1850 attempted another fix, admitting California as a free state, but also enacting a draconian Fugitive Slave Act, which enraged many Northerners by forcing them to participate in the capture of freedom seekers. Anti-slavery sentiments grew strong in the North, moving from the margins to the mainstream. Abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison celebrated the potential for emancipation, while formerly enslaved people like Frederick Douglass became powerful voices against the institution itself. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin brought the horrors of slavery into Northern homes, further galvanizing opposition. In response, the South dug in, abandoning the earlier notion of slavery as a, quote, necessary evil, and aggressively promoting it as a, quote, positive good, beneficial for both enslavers and the enslaved, and superior to the wage slavery of those in the factories in the North. Southern thinkers like George Fitzhugh championed this ideology. Politics fractured under the strain. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, championed by Stephen Douglas, introduced the idea of popular sovereignty, letting settlers decide on slavery, but led to a bloody conflict in Bleeding, Kansas. Added to that, the Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case in 1857 that declared black people could not be citizens and that Congress had no power to restrict slavery's expansion was a stunning victory for the South, but it also galvanized and possibly inspired more than anything else John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, an attempt to spark a massive slave uprising. And this, along with other things, terrified the South and fully polarized the nation. This period witnessed a profound hardening of ideologies. The North, increasingly committed, though often inconsistently, to the ideals of free labor and expanding liberty, found itself in direct opposition to a South whose entire social, economic, and political system rested on the foundation of racial slavery, and now defended it as a moral positive, not a necessity. Compromise became virtually impossible because the fundamental worldviews were now irreconcilable. This deep ideological chasm, fueled by the economic engine of King Cotton, set the stage for secession and civil war. Abraham Lincoln declared in 1861, quote, "We must settle this question now, whether in a free government the minority have the right to break up the government whenever they choose." The election of Lincoln in 1860 on the Republican platform explicitly opposing the expansion of slavery into Western territories was the final catalyst. Believing their entire way of life was under existential threat, especially slavery, Southern states began to secede from the Union. As Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens bluntly stated in March of 1861, the Confederacy's cornerstone, quote, rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery is his natural and normal condition. Historian Stephanie McCurry, in her book Confederate Reckoning, describes the Confederate project as an attempt to build, quote, a modern pro-slavery and anti-democratic state, dedicated to the proposition that all men were not created equal, end quote. This project, however, was fraught with internal contradictions. McCurry argues that Confederate leaders falsely assumed the unwavering loyalty of three crucial groups. The first was poor white men, the second was white women, and third, and possibly most significantly, was the 4 million enslaved people whose labor underpinned the entire system. Throughout the war, these groups challenged the Confederate state. Poor women, often identifying as soldiers' wives, demanded government support and protested inequalities, while enslaved people seized any opportunity they could that was created by the conflict to undermine the Confederacy from within or to self-emancipate. Now, Lincoln initially declared secession and the secession documents legally void, and the North went to the war primarily to preserve the Union. But the conflict rapidly evolved. Enslaved people themselves forced the issue of freedom to the front of the war's aims. Fleeing plantations in massive numbers, they sought refuge behind Union lines. Union General Benjamin Butler pragmatically declared them, quote, contraband of war in 1861, a crucial early step acknowledging their agency. Their actions, coupled with the arguments of abolitionists and the glowing realization that striking at slavery meant striking at the Confederacy's heart itself, pushed Lincoln and the North towards emancipation. So the Emancipation Proclamation, then, was issued because of this. It was issued after the bloody Battle of Antietam, where the North won, and it took effect on January 1st, 1863, transforming the war's purpose. Though it initially exempted areas under Union control and the border states, it declared enslaved people in Confederate territory forever free and authorized the enlistment of black soldiers in the Union Army. This was revolutionary. Black soldiers, many formerly enslaved themselves, fought bravely for the Union cause, contributing significantly to its victory while simultaneously fighting for their own freedom and equality. As James Henry Gooding, a black soldier, insisted, they demanded, quote, to be treated as American soldiers, not as menial hirelings, end quote. The war itself was a brutal, transformative experience, as detailed in the textbook. Battles like Gettysburg and the Siege of Vicksburg marked crucial turning points. The scale of death and destruction was unprecedented in American history, far exceeding the casualty in all other wars in U.S. history combined. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea employed what he called hard war tactics, devastating Confederate infrastructure and weakening its morale. On the home front, women took on new roles in farms and factories, as well as nursing, with figures like Dorothea Dix organizing Union nurses. The federal government expanded its power significantly, enacting legislation like the Homestead Act and funding the Transcontinental Railroad, as well as establishing a national currency, all things we'll touch on in a later episode. When Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to the Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865, the war was effectively over. Slavery, the cornerstone of the Confederacy, was destroyed, soon to be formally abolished nationwide by the 13th Amendment. The Union was preserved, but the cost was immense, and the questions facing the nation were profound, and that's where we have to start. Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, just weeks before his assassination, ordered and offered a vision of this reconciliation. Quote, "With malice towards none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds," end quote. Yet binding those wounds would provide and prove to be extraordinarily difficult. Historian James McPherson speaks of the war facilitating a shift from negative liberty, freedom from interference, to a positive liberty, the freedom to act, requiring the capacity and rights to participate in a full society and to participate fully. The central challenge emerging from the war was how to define and secure this positive liberty for 4 million plus newly freed people. The exclamation of a black Union soldier upon encountering his former enslaver, quote, "Hello, massa, bottom rail, top this time," end quote. And it captured the revolutionary potential of the moment. But the struggle to make the potential a reality was actually just beginning. The Civil War was a crucible, destroying the old slaveholding republic and forcing Americans to confront their founding contradictions. It redefined citizenship, federal power, and the very meaning of the nation. And it set the stage for this turbulent era that we are going to look at next time, Reconstruction. So as we conclude, let's take a look back at what we've done. We've journeyed from the revolution's dawn with its inspiring ideals and inherent contradictions through the turbulent growth of the nations increasingly divided by westward expansion and the entrenchment of slavery, to the failure of political compromise and the fiery crucible of the Civil War itself. By 1865, the Union had been preserved, and chattel slavery, the institution that had shaped American life for over 2 centuries and fueled the conflict, was legally dead. But the end of the war marked not an end, but a new beginning, filled with profound and unanswered questions. These are the questions that will drive our exploration in the rest of this podcast series. Questions that will be deeply explored as you follow along in the American Yawp. What did freedom truly mean for 4 million African Americans emancipated from bondage? Would it include not just freedom from chains, but economic independence and civil rights and political power and access to education and protection from violence? How would the defeated Southern states, built on a foundation of white supremacy and slavery, be brought back into a union now ostensibly dedicated to equality? What would be the future of race relations, not just in the South, but across the entire nation? And how would the balance of power between the federal government, newly strengthened by this war, and individual states be redefined now that the war was over? These were the central challenges of Reconstruction, the period we will turn to in our next episode. The issues central to Reconstruction, citizenship, rights, economic and racial justice, are as old as the Republic itself and remain deeply relevant today. The way Americans grappled with these questions after 1865 continues to shape our current society. The Civil War and emancipation constituted a profound break, what one historian calls a second founding, an attempt to remake the nation on the principle of equality. Yet, as historian David Blight notes in Race and Reunion, the memory of the war itself became contested ground. A push for reconciliation between white Northerners and Southerners often came at the expense of remembering the war's central cause, slavery, and the promise of equality for Black Americans. Blight reminds us, quote, "Americans have had to work through the meaning of the Civil War in its rightful place in the politics of memory. As long as we have a politics of race in America, we will have a politics of Civil War memory," end quote. The revolution begun in 1776 and profoundly reshaped by the Civil War remained in 1865 unfinished. The landscape had been irrevocably altered, but the struggle over the nation's meaning and direction would continue. As we move forward from 1865, we must ask, how would Americans attempt to answer the profound questions left by the war? Would they truly succeed in creating that, quote, new birth of freedom Lincoln envisioned at Gettysburg? Thank you for joining me on this introductory episode. Join me next time as we delve into the turbulent and transformative era known as Reconstruction. And I'll see y'all in the past.